So I'm Brandon Boswell. Who am I? I'm co-conqueror at Content.com. So if you haven't heard the pitch, we're a real-time market for photo and video journalism. So we enable media companies around the world to take the photos and videos they shoot in real time, sell them to other news organizations around the world. It's the fastest you'll ever hear it anywhere. But anyway, so before we start, a few things to kind of take into account if you have an L3 app that you're thinking about moving to L4. The big question you have to do is you have to do your homework and really determine, is it really worth migrating? Because like the word migrate is bold for a very big reason. It's not just like this easy upgrade. It's not like WordPress 2 to WordPress 3 and you press a button and it magically does it. It is definitely like a migration process. You're going to invest a lot of time. Make sure you have really good reasons for doing so. So some of the reasons that we did it is one, for easy integration with background queues. We were also integrating multiple apps inside the company that were in multiple platforms into a new platform. And it was a really good time for us to actually take the time and invest it to kind of make sure we're up to date and give us the best ability moving forward to integrate features easily, really integrate Composer in a really big way, and allow us to be really, really agile and move really quickly. So those were some of the big reasons why we did it. There's a bunch of other ones that I didn't really go into, but make sure you have a really good reason to. A lot of the features that Laravel 4 has can be bootstrapped into Laravel 3. So like initially I was like, oh yeah, we definitely need to move to Laravel 4. It's the latest, greatest, we have to do it. And then about halfway through or 3/4 way through, I was like, I could have saved myself like 50 or 60 hours by not doing this. When I finished, I definitely think it was worth it in the end, but just kind of know what you're getting yourself into and make sure like the company really values that and you're not going to be asked over and over like, why are we investing this time? Why are we doing this? Because you'll get about halfway through and go, why did I take on this project? You'll get to the point where like there's no return and you just have to finish it at that point. But so how long did it take? So my wife was going out of town for the weekend, which is rare. So I said, this is as good a time as any to actually like bundle down for the weekend and just spend a weekend with Laravel. So from the time I actually started the project on a Friday evening till about the end of the day the next Friday, that's about the time it took to actually move from Laravel 3 to Laravel 4 and actually get it into production, tested, and ready for about 10,000 users to look at. So just kind of know that. If you have multiple developers, you could probably speed that up a little bit. We have about a medium-sized code base, around 14,000 lines of code. It's not small, it's not big. It's a time investment. Yes, sir.
Was that what you were primarily doing for at that time, or did you have other things going on?
So there were a few different initiatives going on the same front at the same time. They're all somewhat related. So originally, Content.com was actually split between 2 or 3 different platforms. So like the front-end advertising side of the company was in WordPress. The social interaction kind of connect social media type deal, that was in Joomla. And then the marketplace, which is kind of my baby, that was always in Laravel. So one of the things that I was trying to do simultaneously was, while moving from Laravel 3 to Laravel 4, also bringing in all the features that were in the other 2 aspects of the site into that one. Now, with that said, most of that hard work had already been done, and it was more integration. But we were also doing all that simultaneous. So there might be a little bit of extra time in there for that. And then one third thing, we were moving from a Joomla-based hosting provider to Amazon at the same time. So one of the things that we kind of said was, we're not going to get this opportunity again to really put some real time towards infrastructure and like future development. So we said we're going to I said we're going to do all of this at once. We're just going to tackle it. We're going to get it done. It's going to take a little while. It's going to be a pain in the butt, but at the end of the day, we're going to be really happy we did. So that was kind of the approach. And I think you have to like take that approach. You can't just kind of like fit this in. Like this is something that's going to take you away from any feature development or anything like that for a little while. So let's get started. So one of the things that I definitely recommend is just start with a fresh repo. Like this is a new version of your site. You need to think about it that way mentally. It's not just upgrading. Start a fresh repo, start with a clean install of Laravel 4, and then migrate individual pieces over. It'll save yourself a lot of trouble, and I'll tell you a little bit why later. But so just start copying over the files. I started with my DevTools first, so I'm on a guard-based compilation. So I've got live reload running, and if we get to the end, I'll tell you a little bit about all my DevTools. But The next thing is start migrating over your configs. It's just about the same between Laravel 3 and Laravel 4. The only difference is Laravel 4 is going to ship with a testing folder automatically, and that will automatically be used by Laravel 4 anytime you're doing automated testing. So it's kind of like a reserved word. Don't use it. If you were using it, make sure you switch it. But that. The third thing is go ahead and start with your views, because if you have any sort of blade-related errors, they will fail silently in Laravel 4. So you'll end up with this blank page or missing components missing completely, and you'll have no rhyme or reason why, and it'll be really, really confusing. So I would say tackle your views first, and because those have widespread effects throughout. And then from there, start with the root, go with the roots, jump to your controllers, and then at the end, just go ahead and copy your public folder over any sort of like images and things like that. The whole like subsequent stuff that's not really core to the application running. So get used to seeing this, because you're gonna see a lot of errors. Like you'll start to get happy when you change one error for another. Like you're gonna be here for a while. But how can we kind of speed up this process? So just know, like at the core of everything that's done in Laravel 3 is that all snake case is been converted to camel case. So has many is now has many, and all those. And also any queries that you do in Eloquent. Like, so does anyone here use like dynamic queries where underscore attribute, and then inside their braces they specify a value? So if you do those, it'll be where and then the capital letter of the attribute instead of where underscore attribute. So just go ahead and save yourself a lot of trouble and just do a find replace for all these things, and it will save you a lot of trouble at the start. When I publish the article that goes with this, I'll have a full list, full checklist of the common find replaces that you should do to just save yourself a ton of time.
Nice.
And they're safe ones. They're not ones that will conflict with something else. On a similar note, there are some syntax changes throughout the framework. So when you come across any sort of syntax change, just go ahead and take a second, do a find replace. I really like Sublime's find replace, where you can actually do it on a file by file basis and make sure you're not doing any weird find replace that you're not expecting, because sometimes there will be some name collisions. So I'm anal and I'll actually watch it. But so one of the big ones is the Eloquent relationship query has many and belongs to is now just belongs to many. It's also camel case like you would expect. And whenever you want to return an error from the application, instead of response error, you'll actually return app abort. When logging in a user manually through maybe some sort of other authentication system, instead of passing auth login ID, you'll pass auth login using ID and then pass in the ID. And I'll have all of the different use cases that I ran into while moving content from L3 to L4. So what I actually did while I was going through this, I just had a markdown document running the whole time. And anytime I ran into an error moving from L3 to L4, I documented what it was. And so basically I have this checklist that if you follow through that checklist before moving over, you should be like, I would hope somewhere between 75 and 85% done with the errors. You should only really encounter any errors that our application didn't touch. So it should save you a lot of time. So what are the big changes in Laravel 4 from like a migration standpoint? So the biggest one that you'll run into immediately is no more bundles. Bundles were okay, but it's kind of what was the problem with PHP for a really long time, is everyone reinventing the wheel rather than piggybacking on what everybody else was doing. So before I was at Content, I was actually doing a lot of Ruby and then also Rails development, and I really fell in love with Ruby gems. So the fact that Composer has really gained such steam so quickly, it's a really beautiful thing. So go ahead and embrace Composer and packages. I have yet to really find a package, yet to not find a package that I was looking for. We were using 10 bundles at Content.com when we moved to L4, and I was able to find a bundle almost immediately for all of them. 3 or 4 of them were actually integrated directly into Laravel 4. So like we were using SendGrid, and now the Mail API is built into Laravel 4, 2 or 3 other ones that fit the same thing. So if you can't find it on Packagist, you either have a really weird request or there's a really great opportunity to build something. But I've actually had pretty good luck with Packagist so far. So the next big thing is probably Eloquent. This is the thing that really kind of took me a long time with Laravel 4 is the changes in Eloquent. So In Laravel 3, when you would do a query for multiple results, Laravel 3 would return you an array as the response to that query. So you would do something like this, or at least I would do something like this. You'll probably tell me it's stupid, but it's okay. So users get if users do something. Well, when you migrate this to L4, it'll actually throw an error because you can actually have an empty users object here and try and perform a function on it, and it won't have that method. So what you need to do to get that same functionality in L4 is do users get users if not is empty, and that will keep you safe from that. So if you do any of that throughout your app, just go through and find any not references to query. Just go ahead and knock those out right now because you'll get really weird errors if you're not using test-driven development. It might take you a little while to realize that something's acting really bizarre. So just go ahead and do that. This one is probably the one that took me the most time because you're actually kind of refactoring business logic at that point. It's not just syntax changes, and you really need to kind of pay attention to it.
Do you ever just use the PHP method of empty and put users inside of it?
So I don't use, so I have used the empty method. I didn't use it here.
That's an eloquent method, but is empty.
What now?
Never mind.
No, this is empty.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, in
There's PHP
in L3?
5.3's got an empty method just in the programming language itself.
So I wasn't using it at the time. There were a few places I used it. It would definitely save you this trouble, I think. Well, actually, no, it's not empty though. The eloquent collection will return true or false to empty.
Yeah.
So actually, I think I did actually have some empty calls in there too, which will kind of get you along the same. Now, with this said, at the time when I was dealing with this, I really hated the fact that they changed it, and now I really love eloquent collections. So give it a minute; you'll end up really loving it. It's just a really big change, especially if you have a lot of logic going through on your site. A similar change in L4 is that collections are no longer arrays. So if you do any sort of shuffling, filtering, any sort of array method on an eloquent collection, it will actually throw an exception because all of the array methods in PHP expect the object to be an array. And eloquent collection is not actually an array. So take for instance this, I was using the end method at the bottom of this. This is a really terrible example, but it shows it. So the end method grabs the last element of an array and returns it. Well, because it's not an array, it's going to throw you an exception. And you're like, what's going on? So all you have to do is these eloquent collections actually have these helper methods built in now. So you can actually do really interesting filtering and sorting built into the collection element, which can be really helpful, especially if you need to add elements in later on or sort them in a really interesting way, like after the query. So just change it to purchases last, which is a method on the collection. You can also do purchases first, and there's a bunch of other ones. One that I needed that wasn't built in was shuffle. If you want afterwards, I can kind of show you how I did it. But basically, you can extend the collection, and it'll start being used in exchange for the default eloquent collection. And they just call the shuffle method. So the way eloquent collections work under the hood, I think I've got time to talk about this, but the way they work under the hood, there's actually a protected items variable, which is actually just an array. So these methods that shuffle first, last, are actually just wrappers for the methods that I was using in Laravel 3. So like the last method in Laravel 4 on the eloquent collection is actually just calling end on the items variable. So they were doing the same thing, but they've actually wrapped it into the collection. So just kind of get used to that. And like I said, so if you need any sort of custom methodology inside your collection, you can actually extend it pretty easily. Controllers. So my word of warning, do as I say, not as I do, is go ahead and regenerate all of your controllers as the new resource controllers. There's a lot of really helpful reasons to do. One, you have a generator that will handle it for you. You'll have a very good REST-based API layer like started for you. And you also get some basic test-driven development to determine whether your method is throwing an error or not. So you get those tests just kind of built in. So what will happen after you run the generator is if one of your methods would throw like a 500, it'll actually fail a test. So it's kind of just a nice little thing. And I actually had a request to use our API recently, and we're not resourceful completely right now. So I kind of wish I had done this, but there just wasn't time.
Does controller make a resource controller, or is it It's not resource. No, I guess I'm wrong.
I'm double check.
I think the default you can say, oh, I don't want to
So you can throw an except to this.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
So if you want to like filter it to only certain methods.
Okay.
Or
I just got the name wrong.
yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, double check behind me, but I did check the docs. Like I said, I haven't used the resource controller, but I recommend that people doing it do. We have like a little bit of a weird use case at Content. If you know a better way to do it, I'd love to hear it. But so we have stories, and stories contain media objects. But you have to have a story to add a media object to it. So what we actually have to do is we actually have to pre-create a story when you begin the authoring experience, so that if you add media objects to it via Ajax, there's a story for them to be wrapped in. So our actual new method, or our edit method, creates a new story object, and then what we do is if you leave the page and don't save it, we clean it up. So it doesn't really play 100% right with the resource methodology, and that's why I didn't go ahead and switch all of our stuff to it. But after my talk, if you know a much more beautiful, eloquent way to do it, I'd love to hear it, because it can be a pain. It doesn't come into equation that often, but it is something that would be nice to be able to clean up. So if you don't use resourceful controllers, like I didn't, it's really terrible. When routing to the new controllers in Laravel 4, it's slightly redundant. Before, you would just call the method name without the REST method. In Laravel 4, because they use the new Symfony routing component, you do still have to specify that HTTP verb. So even though you're calling route get, when you mention the method here, you also have to specify the get. If it was a post or a put, you'd put that there as well. So all of your routes, your controller routes, are likely going to have to be updated. It's not complicated, but you just need to make sure that you do it, or else your routes won't work. All right, more in depth on routing. So routing got a big. Oh, go ahead.
That's if you don't use the resource controller.
If you use the resource controller, you don't have to do it. But if you're utilizing L3 RESTful style controllers, you need to make sure you do that. Routing got slightly more verbose, but you got a ton more control. So one of the beautiful things about Laravel 4 routing is when you route to a controller. So just in case people don't know, you can actually route to a controller automatically by specifying this in your route file, and then any methods in your controller can automatically be routed to based on this. But one of the really great things in Laravel 4 is you now specify this first key, and that's the URI that's used for that controller. So you can actually, in Laravel 3, it had to be whatever the controller name was. But in Laravel 4, you can actually specify your own name and change it on the fly. So like for us, we use users as the basis for groups. And we can actually just specify this controller route twice and make it accessible from either location. So it gives you a lot of flexibility if you want to change your URIs on the fly, if you have that flexibility. If you have a long-term app that people are expecting permalinks, you can't do that. We're still a young app, so we can do that. So, the route syntax changed quite a bit. Instead of the old type syntax, where it was a colon and then the type of the variable expected in the route, you now just pass in brackets what the var name will be. And so you get an example of it here. So there's your ID, and you match it over there. Instead of using the type style syntax, you now specify restrictions in regex at the end of a route. So this example would limit it to just numbers. And the other beautiful thing that you can do is you can actually specify defaults. So in Laravel 3, what I would have to do is if I wanted to set a default, I'd actually have to wrap a route to a controller. So if I wanted to send to a controller, but I wanted to have a default or change the order of the variables, I would actually have to route the controller, wrap the controller in an additional route. And now I can actually get around that in Laravel 4, which is kind of nice. So one of the other things that was kind of dropped from L3 to L4 is the asset manager that was built in. So you kind of have two options now. The bottom one, you can switch to just an HTML helper that creates script tags and style tags for you. Or you can switch to Jason Lewis's library, which is really, really powerful, slightly complicated, but I think once you get it set up right, it'll be really helpful. It's akin to kind of the Ruby on Rails asset pipeline, where it will actually compile down your script and your JavaScript files and your like Sass, Less, and just straight CSS files when in production. So in production, it will minify and concatenate all those for you. And in development, it will actually keep them separately. That way you can maintain your line numbers and kind of know what's going on. It's another one of those things that you need to invest a little bit of time if you want to use because it just doesn't quite work out of the box. Not that he did anything wrong, it just didn't quite match up with my setup as far as how my assets work. But I think there's a lot of reward there if you can actually get it to run the way you want it to. So who here has used the getter and setter methods in Laravel for their eloquent calls? All right, cool. So I really love getters and setters. They've changed a little bit in Laravel 4. They're now called accessors and mutators. And one of the big changes is the syntax in which you call them. So at the top is the Laravel 3 way. So get underscore whatever the model attribute name is. And then you would say this get attribute, and then you pull that key. In Laravel 4, it's much, much shorter. It's a little bizarre because in the database, they will still be snake case. But when you call the methods in PHP, they'll be camel case. So Taylor actually wrote a library that would switch snake case and camel case. So the main thing you have to do now is it'll be get and the capital letter of the attribute name, and then it'll be appended at the end with the word attribute. And that's how Laravel knows to do a dynamic accessor or mutator. So get, and then the attribute name, and then attribute. And that's how it knows to actually do the dynamic getters and setters. The other thing is that you now have to pass in the value. It will do it automatically for you, but you need to make this variable accessible. So what it'll do is it'll pass in the value from the database and pass it into your equation. So setters are really, really similar. The same exact syntax. The only thing is when you're actually setting the value, instead of doing set underscore attributes, you'll pass it similar to an attributes array. So this attributes and then the key name, and then you just pass in the value. Pretty straightforward. Logging is a little different. Under the hood, it's actually run on a composer bundle called Monolog. And you can actually pull out access to the full Monolog library if you want to. But the biggest thing you have to know when just trying to do a straight migrate is that log write can now be log info, log error, or log warning. Log write doesn't work anymore. So just swap to the most appropriate one for you. So the gotchas, the really big gotchas that you just didn't expect to cause you any trouble. This next one cost me like a few hours of my life. In Laravel 3, if you use a blade template, which is basically a template that doesn't actually get interpolated into the view when you're done. So it's like an HTML template, I mean an HTML comment, but it doesn't show up. So it's really nice for tips for other developers on your team or explanation of how your views work. Just a lot of clarity that you don't necessarily need the public knowing. So in Laravel 3, it was brace, brace, or bracket, bracket, dash, dash, and it would work just great. In Laravel 4, you need to actually close it, or it will just return nothing to the screen. It's not a problem, you just have to know. So like, if you've been doing it in Laravel 3 for a long time and you have these littered throughout your views, it'll take you a little while to find all the places where you did it wrong. And the worst part about it is it just fails silently. There's no error. You just get nothing back to the screen, and you're just really confused. Because the error handling in Laravel 4 is way different than Laravel 3 anyway. And if you get nothing back, you're just like, what the hell? And you just undo, and you go, what did I change, and how could this have possibly done this? The other thing is if you use the built-in MIME type support from Laravel 3, it's not there anymore. So we use it a lot for not necessarily validation, but determining what a file type was, whether it was a photo, whether it was a video, whether it was an unrelated type. It's not 100% secure, so that's probably why they dropped it, but we just needed an indication of how to handle a file. So if you need to get by and you want that functionality back, I've actually wrapped the Laravel 3 version of the file object in a composer bundle, and it's namespace to L3. So all you have to do is install that composer bundle and then just call L3 file instead of file, and you'll have that method available to you again. And then just paste the MIME type config back into your config area. Does that make sense? I'm running through it really fast. I'm assuming a little bit. Sorry. All right, URL helper changes. These are basically syntax, so I'm not going to explain a ton. But URL base is now just URL2. toAsset is asset. They basically drop the twos across the board. And any sort of paths, rather than passing in a key to the path method, they just created their own method specifically for it. And URL no longer has a trailing slash. So if you're expecting that slash for your path, make sure you add it in at the end of your key. So if you want a path plus John, and then you're expecting the slash from Laravel 3, make sure you pass in the slash, or else your paths will just silently fail. All right, auth. So has anyone here like used a custom auth driver for Eloquent or had to do anything weird with that? So like I said, at Content we had a Joomla backend before I came on, so we had to be able to still authenticate with that. So Eloquent actually gives you the ability to wrap their driver and specify your own authentication method. So you can actually call out to a different driver, call out to a third-party service completely. Gives you a lot of flexibility with authentication. So we were using that at Content. The logic's not that different, but the syntax is. And I got a feeling most people aren't going to run into it. So if you do run into it, hit that link. This person did a really good job of explaining how you do it. It's not that complicated. It's just going to take you a little while to wrap your head around it. So sort of resources to kind of wrap your head around this and kind of get started is watch the Userscape screencast. They'll explain to you why you'd even want
Jokers
Laravel.
work there.
I know, they're nuts. Jeffrey Way goes into all the reasons why you should move to Laravel 4. Jason Lewis actually talks about kind of a lot of the similar things to what I've talked about of what you should prepare for in moving your app. And then there's also a list of method name changes. It's not very complete, but it does have a few that'll just kind of get you started. This was what I used to kind of set the basis for my kind of setup.